The United States and Canada have long shared one of the world's most integrated trade relationships. For decades, goods, services, and raw materials flowed freely between the two countries, supporting jobs and industries on both sides of the border. However, this balance was disrupted when the U.S. government imposed a sweeping set of tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods on February 1, 2025. While these measures were framed as a response to border security and drug trafficking concerns, their real impact was economic. The U.S. was looking to put pressure on Canada's economy, forcing the country into submission through aggressive trade restrictions. The tariffs were wide-ranging, affecting most Canadian exports except for oil and energy, which faced lower rates. The strategy seemed clear: apply economic pressure, force Canada to concede, and reinforce American dominance in the trade relationship. The assumption in Washington was that Canada would absorb the blow and eventually negotiate under U.S. terms. However, this assumption was flawed. Instead of backing down, Canada responded with an economic counterattack that not only hurt American industries but also challenged the very idea that the U.S. could dictate trade terms without consequences. Just days after the U.S. tariffs were announced, Canada unveiled a powerful response: a $155 billion tariff package targeting American exports. Unlike the broad and unfocused U.S. measures, Canada's response was calculated and strategic. The first phase, valued at $30 billion, was implemented immediately and focused on key American industries with high political and economic importance. The second phase, worth an additional $125 billion, was scheduled to follow soon after, ensuring that the pressure would not be short-lived. This aggressive move by Canada marked a turning point. The countermeasures targeted sectors that were not just economically vital to the U.S. but also politically significant to the current administration. The Canadian government was not just reacting, it was making sure that the impact was felt where it would hurt the most. By focusing on industries with strong lobbying power and political influence, Canada aimed to turn American businesses and workers against their own government's trade policies. Despite its strong response, Canada could not completely avoid the economic damage caused by the U.S. tariffs. The restrictions led to an estimated $2.1 billion loss for the Canadian economy, affecting various industries that rely on cross-border supply chains. The automotive sector was among the hardest hit, with manufacturers struggling to deal with increased costs and logistical disruptions. Agriculture, another key industry, also faced major setbacks, particularly in the export of grains, dairy, and meat products. Additionally, Canada's technology sector, which depends on U.S. partnerships and investments, experienced financial strain as businesses adjusted to the new trade environment. While these losses were significant, it soon became clear that the U.S. was not escaping the consequences either. Canada's countermeasures began to take a serious toll on American industries, demonstrating that economic warfare is never a one-sided battle. The U.S. had underestimated the impact of retaliatory tariffs and was now experiencing the full force of Canada's economic pushback. The effects were felt almost immediately in sectors that relied heavily on Canadian trade. American manufacturers that depended on Canadian raw materials and supply chains were suddenly faced with rising costs and production delays. Agriculture, one of the most politically sensitive industries, was also feeling the heat. Canadian tariffs on American agricultural products, including beef, pork, and grains, made it harder for U.S. farmers to sell their goods across the border. This led to surplus products in the domestic market, driving down prices and cutting into farmers' profits. Meanwhile, the American automotive sector, already under pressure from global supply chain disruptions, was further impacted by Canada's targeted tariffs on U.S.-made vehicles and auto parts. These tariffs made American cars more expensive for Canadian consumers, reducing demand and putting additional strain on U.S. auto manufacturers. Companies that had relied on a steady flow of exports to Canada now faced declining sales and increasing uncertainty about their future. The economic strain caused by these tariffs was not just limited to businesses. Consumers in both countries began to see rising prices as companies passed on the higher costs to customers. Grocery store prices increased due to the added costs of importing food products. The price of household appliances, clothing, and electronics also saw an upward trend as tariffs affected consumer goods moving across the border. In the U.S., frustration was growing as businesses and workers started to realize the true cost of the trade war. the Canadian government made. It was clear that its countermeasures were not just about economic retaliation, they were about defending national sovereignty. Canadian leaders framed their response as a necessary action to protect jobs, industries, and long-term economic stability. They emphasized that Canada was not willing to be bullied into submission by a trade partner that was acting unilaterally. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly stated that Canada was willing to negotiate a resolution but would not do so under threats or economic coercion. His message was clear: if the US wanted to impose unfair trade restrictions, Canada would respond in kind. This approach not only rallied domestic support but also reinforced the idea that Canada was prepared to stand its ground in the face of economic aggression. As tensions escalated, questions began to emerge about the broader implications of this trade war. Was the US underestimating Canada's ability to fight back? Could this dispute lead to long-term damage to the North American trade relationship? And perhaps most critically, was the US risking its own economic stability in an attempt to assert dominance over a key ally? The economic backlash was only beginning, and the consequences were becoming increasingly difficult for the US to ignore. While Washington had initiated the trade war with the expectation of gaining leverage, it was quickly becoming clear that the strategy was backfiring. With supply chains disrupted, industries struggling, and political pressure mounting, the US found itself facing a growing crisis of its own making. This trade dispute was no longer just about tariffs, it was about economic survival, political consequences, and the shifting balance of power between two of the world's closest trade partners. As Canada continued to escalate its response, the impact on the American economy was only going to grow. The question now was not whether the US would feel the consequences, but how severe those consequences would be. What had started as a calculated move by the US to pressure Canada into submission had instead ignited a trade conflict that was spiraling out of control. The economic losses, the industry disruptions, and the growing political fallout suggested that this was not going to be an easy battle for either side. With tensions rising and no immediate resolution in sight, the future of US-Canada trade relations was more uncertain than ever. The trade conflict between the United States and Canada was no longer just about tariffs. It was rapidly turning into a broader economic standoff, with both countries looking for ways to gain the upper hand. While Canada's initial response had focused on direct countermeasures through tariffs, the government soon escalated its strategy by urging citizens to take action in ways that would further pressure the American economy. One of the most significant moves came in the form of a call for Canadians to reduce or completely stop traveling to the United States. This was not just a symbolic gesture but a calculated economic strike aimed at one of America's most vulnerable sectors, tourism and hospitality. The United States has long been one of the most popular destinations for Canadian travelers, with millions crossing the border every year for vacations, shopping, and business. By discouraging travel, Canada was targeting a key source of American revenue, adding another layer to its economic retaliation. The impact of this travel boycott was felt almost immediately. Airlines and travel agencies reported a surge in cancellations as Canadians opted to stay home or redirect their travel plans to other international destinations. Major tourist hubs in the US, including Florida, California, New York, and Nevada, were among the hardest hit. Florida, which has historically been a top vacation destination for Canadians, was particularly vulnerable in 2023. Canadians accounted for nearly 40% of all foreign visitors to the state, contributing billions to the local economy. With fewer Canadian tourists arriving, businesses in the travel and hospitality industries began to see declining revenues. The financial losses quickly added up. According to data from the US Travel Association, even a 10% reduction in Canadian visitors could result in over 2 million fewer trips to the US, leading to a loss of roughly $2.1 billion in revenue. This was not just a theoretical estimate. Hotel chains, restaurants, and retail stores that relied on Canadian customers were already seeing the effects. The economic ripple extended beyond tourism, affecting local businesses that depended on the increased spending from travelers. Resorts, casinos, and entertainment venues, particularly in cities like Las Vegas and Miami, also saw a drop in attendance as a result of fewer Canadian tourists. Government officials in the US began to express concern over the worsening situation. The National Travel and Tourism Office highlighted that Canadian visitors contributed more to the US economy than any other foreign travelers. The economic loss from reduced Canadian tourism was now a growing concern for state and local governments, which had to adjust their financial projections based on the declining revenue. At the same time, Canada was taking additional steps to ensure that its countermeasures had long-term effects. The government launched initiatives to encourage domestic travel, urging Canadians to explore their own country rather than spending their money abroad. In speeches and public statements, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reinforced this message, encouraging citizens to rethink their vacation plans and invest in their local economy instead. The campaign, which promoted Canadian national parks, cultural sites, and regional attractions, received strong support from the public and businesses eager to capture the redirected travel spending. Alongside the travel restrictions, Canada also intensified its efforts to limit American influence in other economic areas. Provincial governments, particularly in regions like Ontario and British Columbia, took steps to reduce their reliance on U.S. imports by prioritizing domestic suppliers. The Ontario Liquor Board, for example, announced plans to remove American-made alcoholic beverages from its shelves, redirecting purchases toward Canadian and European alternatives. These moves further reinforced the economic divide that was growing between the two countries. The United States, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the deeper consequences of its own trade policies. What had initially seemed like a strong negotiating tactic was now spiraling into an economic problem that was affecting American businesses and workers across multiple industries. The initial belief that Canada would simply absorb the impact and continue business as usual had proven to be a major miscalculation. Instead, the U.S. was now facing an economic backlash that was growing more severe by the day. The agriculture sector in the U.S. was among those feeling the most pressure. Canada's tariffs on American agricultural products, including beef, pork, grains, and dairy, were making it increasingly difficult for U.S. farmers to sell their goods across the border. These products, which had once flowed freely into Canada, were now subject to higher costs, reducing their competitiveness in the market. As a result, many American farmers found themselves with surplus products they couldn't sell at profitable prices. This drove prices down domestically, leading to lower revenues and financial strain for farmers who were already struggling with rising operational costs. The situation was particularly dire in states that depended heavily on agricultural exports to Canada. States like Iowa, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, which had strong trade ties with Canada, were now seeing reduced demand for their products. Farmers who had built their businesses on cross-border trade were suddenly left searching for new markets, while others were forced to cut production or take financial losses. In the manufacturing sector, the consequences of the trade war were equally damaging. Factories that relied on Canadian raw materials, such as steel and aluminum, were experiencing supply chain disruptions. The increased costs of importing these materials from Canada forced companies to either absorb the expenses or pass them on to consumers. Many businesses chose the latter option, leading to higher prices for everyday goods, from cars to construction materials. The impact on manufacturing was not just financial. Companies that faced declining revenues due to disrupted trade began to lay off workers or scale back their operations. This added to the economic strain, with job losses creating further uncertainty in already struggling industries. In some regions, workers and businesses began pressuring their local representatives to take action and push back against the escalating trade war. Despite these growing challenges, the U.S. government maintained its stance, insisting that the tariffs were necessary for national security and economic protection. However, the reality on the ground told a different story. The trade war was no longer just about negotiating better terms, it was about managing the fallout of policies that were having unintended consequences. At this stage, neither side appeared willing to back down. Canada was determined to continue its countermeasures, reinforcing the message that it would not be pressured into submission. Meanwhile, the U.S. was facing a growing number of internal challenges, with industries and businesses questioning whether the aggressive trade strategy was worth the economic damage it was causing. The battle over tariffs had evolved into a much larger conflict, one that was reshaping trade relationships, economic policies, and even consumer behavior. With tensions rising and economic losses mounting, the question remained whether either side would be willing to make concessions or if the trade war would continue to escalate. The consequences of this standoff were becoming more serious by the day, and the economic stakes had never been higher. As the trade conflict between the United States and Canada intensified, the economic consequences became even more pronounced. What had started as a series of tariffs meant to pressure Canada into compliance had instead turned into a full-scale economic battle, with both sides feeling the strain. While Canada's strategic countermeasures were carefully designed to inflict damage on key American industries, the fallout within the United States was escalating beyond what policymakers had anticipated. One of the most significant developments in Canada's economic retaliation was its targeted approach toward U.S. exports. By imposing tariffs on specific goods that were deeply embedded in American supply chains, Canada ensured that the impact was felt across multiple industries. The agricultural sector, which had already been suffering from reduced exports, was seeing even more distress. Corn, soybean, and wheat farmers, once reliant on Canadian buyers, were left searching for new markets, but the transition was neither immediate nor seamless. Without a steady demand, prices continued to drop, and many farmers were forced to sell their crops at a loss. Dairy and livestock farmers faced similar challenges. The tariffs on American beef and pork were making it increasingly difficult for U.S. producers to sell their products in Canada, leading to oversupply and lower prices in the domestic market. The financial strain was forcing some smaller farms to shut down, while larger agricultural businesses were reconsidering their long-term investments. The growing uncertainty was also discouraging banks and lenders from extending credit to struggling farmers, further deepening the crisis. Beyond agriculture, the industrial and manufacturing sectors were also experiencing the effects of the trade war. Factories that depended on exports to Canada were now grappling with declining sales, forcing them to scale back production. The auto industry, which had already been hit hard, saw further disruptions as American car manufacturers struggled to absorb the higher costs of imported Canadian parts. With supply chains disrupted and costs rising, many automakers had no choice but to increase the prices of their vehicles, making them less competitive in both domestic and international markets. The impact of rising costs extended to consumers, who were now seeing higher prices across a range of goods. Household appliances, electronics, and even basic grocery items were becoming more expensive due to the increased costs of imported materials and products. Retailers were struggling to balance their pricing strategies, knowing that passing on too many costs to consumers could drive away customers. Many businesses had to choose between absorbing the financial hit or risking a drop in sales. For lower-income families, these price increases were especially burdensome, adding to the growing frustration with the trade policies. In response to the economic turmoil, political pressure on the U.S. administration was mounting. Business leaders, trade associations, and state officials from regions most affected by the tariffs were urging the federal government to reconsider its approach. Governors from states with strong trade ties to Canada, such as Michigan, New York, and Illinois, publicly voiced concerns over the economic downturn. Many of these states relied on cross-border commerce to sustain jobs and economic growth, and the disruption was leading to fears of long-term economic damage. Even within Washington, lawmakers were divided on the issue, while some supported the administration's stance, arguing that the tariffs were a necessary tool to protect American industries. Others warned that the policy was proving to be counterproductive. The economic slowdown and rising costs were beginning to outweigh any potential benefits, and some members of Congress were pushing for negotiations to ease the trade tensions before the damage became irreversible. At the same time, Canada was proving that it was not willing to back down. Rather than seeking a quick resolution, Canadian leaders remained steadfast in their commitment to defending their economy. The government's encouragement of domestic consumption and trade diversification efforts were beginning to show results. Canadian businesses that once depended on American imports were now shifting their focus to European and Asian markets, strengthening trade agreements with other international partners. This shift meant that even if the trade war were to end, Canada would have established new economic pathways that reduced its dependence on the U.S. One of the most symbolic moves in Canada's economic counteroffensive was its call for a travel boycott of the United States. With millions of Canadians visiting the U.S. every year, the decision to discourage travel had a direct and immediate impact on American tourism. Hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues in major tourist destinations began seeing a decline in Canadian visitors, leading to significant revenue losses. Florida, California, and Nevada were among the states hit hardest, as they had long relied on Canadian tourists to boost their economies. The boycott was not just limited to leisure travel. Canadian businesses and organizations also began canceling conferences and events that were planned in the US, opting to hold them in Canada or other countries instead. Airlines and travel agencies reported a noticeable drop in bookings for US destinations, reinforcing the growing economic impact of Canada's strategic response. As the trade war dragged on, American public sentiment toward the situation was shifting. While initial support for tariffs had been driven by the idea of protecting American jobs, the reality was proving to be more complex. Workers in industries affected by the trade dispute were feeling the direct consequences, with layoffs increasing and job security becoming uncertain. Many began questioning whether the trade policies were achieving their intended goals or simply creating more economic hardship. Media coverage of the trade war highlighted the struggles of businesses and workers caught in the crossfire. Stories of farmers unable to sell their crops, factory workers facing layoffs, and consumers struggling with higher prices were becoming more common. The economic strain was not just theoretical, it was affecting real people, and the dissatisfaction was growing. Meanwhile, financial markets were reacting to the uncertainty. Investors were wary of the long-term effects of prolonged trade tensions, leading to fluctuations in stock prices. Companies with heavy exposure to Canadian markets saw their valuations decline, and economic analysts warned that continued instability could lead to a broader downturn. The central question remained, how long could the US sustain this economic standoff before the costs became too high? While the administration continued to insist that the tariffs were necessary to force Canada into better trade terms, it was becoming evident that Canada was not backing down. Instead, it was adapting and strengthening its economy for a future in which reliance on the United States would be significantly reduced. For decades, the US had been able to use its economic power to dictate trade relationships, but this trade war was proving that times were changing. Canada's ability to retaliate effectively and maintain economic resilience was challenging the long-held assumption that the US could pressure its neighbors into submission. The more the trade conflict continued, the clearer it became that the era of unquestioned American economic dominance was being tested like never before.